Okay, so this chapter and the one after it both deal with the motor systems. So I say all the time that the brain only really does two things. One of which is take in information about the outside world through the sensory systems. So we've spent the past 4 or 5 chapters talking about the sensory systems. And so now we're going to start talking about what the other thing is that the nervous system is responsible for, which is movement. So everything that your body does that involves movement usually can be controlled or coordinated by the nervous system, and that's done through the motor systems part of the nervous system. So that's again what the next two or three chapters actually deal with. So first we're going to talk about just the basics of how muscles and motor neurons work, and how the muscles are controlled through circuits in the spinal cord. And then the next chapter will deal with how the muscles are controlled by the brain. So first let's talk about muscle itself. So muscle is a special kind of tissue that only animals possess, and its only job, the only thing it can do is contract, meaning that it can create a force by pulling. And so there are in us, at least, there are, broadly speaking, two major types of muscle. Smooth muscle is the muscle that lines your digestive tract and the arterial half of your circulatory system. And it's responsible for a lot of involuntary movement within your body, moving stuff around inside your body, especially along your digestive tract, and controlling blood pressure in your circulatory system. So it is controlled by a division of the nervous system called the autonomic nervous system, which we will be talking about later. And then striated muscle is the rest of the muscle in your body, the bulk of the muscle in your body. And it is in basically two forms: the cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle is what it sounds like. It's the muscle of the heart. So the heart itself is basically just a big pump, and the muscles that contract and push blood in and out of the heart are a special type of striated muscle. The word striated just means striped or layered, because this particular kind of muscle just has that kind of appearance under the microscope. And the skeletal muscle is also pretty much what it sounds like. It is the muscle that's attached to your bones, and it is the muscle that's responsible for voluntary movement, meaning movement of your body. So skeletal muscle basically consists of just long fibers of fibrous cells containing muscle that have the ability to contract, which means they get shorter, and that means they can pull from either end. So most skeletal muscle fibers are really just long cells that actually have multiple nuclei. So actually there are multiple cells that are kind of fused together. And then the muscle that the proteins that fill up the muscle fibers have the ability to pull the ends of the fiber toward each other. And that's what we mean by contraction, and that applies to the force that a muscle can produce. The part of the nervous system that controls skeletal muscle, as opposed to the smooth muscle, is called the somatic motor system. And again, that's mostly what this chapter deals with. And skeletal muscle is responsible for what we think of as voluntary movement, which means movement that you have some conscious control over, as opposed to, again, movement of food in your digestive tract, or movement of blood in your blood vessels, and so on. However, as we'll learn, there are some movements associated with skeletal muscle that, even though you can control them voluntarily, nevertheless are reflexive and involuntary. So we'll talk about examples of that later on. And so if you look at a set of muscles, most skeletal muscle is associated with a joint. So a joint is just usually where two parts of your skeletal system meet, and they're able to rotate with respect to each other. So your elbow, for example, is an example of a joint, and it consists of the large upper arm bone called the humerus, and then the two bones of the forearm, the radius and the ulna. And so the muscles that control the joint are attached to those bones. So you have various muscles that are attached to both sets of bones, and they both work by pulling the bones different directions. So the muscles that cause the joint to bend or flex we call flexors. So flexion means motion. In this case, it means in this direction. So for most joints, flexion means sort of reducing the angle of the joint, bringing the bones closer together. And the muscles that carry that out are called flexors. So in your arm, there are two sets of flexors, or for the elbow anyway, the biceps and the brachialis. So both of those bones are muscles are attached to the bones of the arm, and when they contract, they pull the two ends of the muscle closer together. By the way, the muscle itself is attached to the bone by a structure called a tendon. So this white stuff is the tendon. And so when the muscle contracts, it pulls on the tendon, which pulls on the bone, and that, in this case, brings the two parts of the arm closer to each other. And then movement in the other direction for this type of joint is called extension. So extension means movement in this direction, which means usually straightening the joint or bringing the two sets of bones farther away from each other. So the muscles that carry out extension are called extensors. And so in the arm, those include the triceps and the anconeus muscles for the elbow. But what's important is both the extensors and the flexors do the same thing. They both contract. So the triceps contract, for example, the same way the biceps do. But just because of the way they're attached to the joint, they cause movement in the opposite direction. So the flexors are attached sort of inside the joint, so the way they contract, they pull the bones closer together, and the triceps are attached sort of around your elbow, and so when they contract, they cause the arm to straighten out. And the elbow joint is structured such that it can't bend past that straightened point, so it can't bend past 180 degrees once it's extended. Another set of terminology: whenever we have two muscles that sort of work together to do the same type of movement, we call them synergists. So the triceps and the anconeus are extensor synergists in the elbow. And then for flexors, the biceps and the brachialis are also synergists because they both work when they're both contracting. They create generally the same type of motion. And when you have two sets of muscles that work in opposite directions, they're called antagonists, because if both muscles were working at the same time, the motion would be reduced or non-existent. Now it's important to have antagonists because, again, muscles can only pull, so they can never push. So in other words, if the flexor muscles contract, they will pull the forearm bones closer to the humerus, and that will cause the arm to bend. But without an antagonist muscle, there is no force in the flexor muscles that can push the arm back out. So either gravity or the activity of these antagonist muscles would be necessary to straighten the arm back out. So every movement of the body requires the contraction of muscles, even if you're talking about an extensor-like movement that actually causes a joint or a limb to extend. And so again, it's the concerted action of those muscles that causes all the various movements your body is capable of. Some more terminology, just as a way of labeling muscles. We're not going to learn all the different muscles. That's anatomy. We're not going to get into that here. But just to recognize some terms, muscles can also be classified by what part of the body they're in and what sort of movements they're generally responsible for. So when we talk about muscles being close to the center of your body or close to the sort of trunk of your body, we call them axial muscles. So that includes like the abdominal muscles, the chest muscles, back muscles, and so on. To some extent, your hips and neck muscles also. And then muscles that are further out along your arms and legs, we call distal muscles. So, and they both work the same way. They both contract, but then they produce different kinds of movements. So the distal muscles, because they're the muscles of your arms and legs, their job is to move those limbs. So most of the things that you require movement, like walking, lifting things, for example, typing, that all requires distal muscles. Whereas the axial muscles, their job is usually just to support the body. They're important for posture and balance, and things like that. And so, whenever you hear those terms, that's what those refer to. And then the neurons that directly control the muscles are called lower motor neurons, or in some cases alpha motor neurons. These neurons are in, for the most part, the spinal cord. There are also some in the brainstem, especially the muscles that control the head and neck. But for most of the body, the motor neurons are found in the spinal cord, specifically in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So if you remember, the spinal cord in cross section has two regions of gray matter. We have the ventral horn, where the motor neurons are found, and the dorsal horn, which is where sensory information comes into the spinal cord. Now, of course, we've talked about the sensory systems a lot already, especially the somatic sensory system. And so we learned that the axons coming into the dorsal horn come from these dorsal ganglion neurons, which are right here. And so that's an important difference between the sensory systems and the motor systems. The neurons of the somatic sensory system are outside the spinal cord. The neurons, or at least the cell bodies of the motor systems, are found inside the spinal cord. In fact, that's why the ventral horn in the spinal cord is usually much bigger than the dorsal horn, because the motor neurons actually just happen to be very large neurons. They have very large cell bodies for a typical neuron. And then their axons come out of the ventral horn, and then leave the spinal cord through the ventral roots. These are just the nerve bundles that come out the ventral side of the spinal cord, and then they meet up with the dorsal horn axons, the dorsal ganglia axons, and form mixed spinal nerves. But then when they get to the muscle, they branch off and form synapses with individual muscle fibers. So again, the muscle fibers are basically big, long cells. And so this is a case where you have a synapse between a neuron and a cell that's not a neuron, it's just a muscle. But that's how they communicate. So we'll talk about this more later, but when the motor neuron wants to send a signal to the muscle, it generates an action potential that travels all the way down this nerve and then triggers another action potential in the muscle fiber. The motor neurons in the spinal cord have a segmental organization, which just means that the motor neurons in any given segment of the spinal cord control muscles in the body that correspond to that segment. So the cervical spinal cord motor neurons, for example, control the muscles of the neck and the shoulders and the arms especially. The motor neurons in the ventral horn, the ventral horn of the thoracic spinal cord, control the muscles of the trunk, so the chest and abdomen and back. And then the motor neurons of the lumbar spinal cord control the muscles of the legs. And in fact, the cervical and lumbar spinal cords are enlarged. They're significantly wider than the ventral horn of the thoracic spinal cord. And that's because there are more motor neurons in those parts of the spinal cord than there are in the thoracic spinal cord. And the reason for that is it's not because there are more muscles necessarily in the arms and legs, but because the amount of control that one needs over the arm and leg muscles is greater than in the thoracic spinal cord. So the trunk muscles, again, which are controlled by the thoracic spinal cord motor neurons, don't need a whole lot of fine control, because their job is mainly just to maintain contraction and maintain body posture and balance, whereas the arm and leg muscles require a lot of fine coordinated control in order to produce complex behaviors. So that's the reason why the spinal cord actually has those bulges at the cervical and lumbar levels. There's also a sort of somatotopic map within the ventral horn. So if you look at the position of the motor neurons in the ventral horn, the neurons that control, for example, the axial muscles are closer to the midline of the spinal cord. So this is inside the ventral horn here. And again, the neurons that control the axial muscles are here, and then the neurons that control the distal muscles are more lateral, out here. And then the muscles that control, for a given joint, control the motor neurons that control flexor muscles are generally found more dorsal to the neurons that control the extensor muscles. So there's almost like a little map of each joint within each segment of the spinal cord. So if you look in the cervical spinal cord, for example, and you were to map out the location of the different types of neurons within the ventral horn, you would see a little map of the arm, essentially, and so there would be an equivalent arrangement in the lumbar spinal cord and so on. And then each of these neurons has, again, axons that synapse onto muscle fibers. So each muscle fiber, and remember that a given muscle is made of a bundle of muscle fibers, but each muscle fiber is under the control of one motor neuron. So each muscle fiber synapses with one and only one motor neuron. Now that motor neuron might form multiple synapses with that fiber. So here you can kind of see that you can see how this neuron is forming sort of multiple synapses with each individual muscle fiber, but each individual muscle fiber is only controlled by one neuron. However, each neuron can control more than one fiber. So within a muscle, again, you have multiple fibers, and a group of fibers can be under the control of one motor neuron. Now, as far as I know, all of the muscle fibers that are controlled by a neuron are always going to be part of the same muscle. You wouldn't see one neuron controlling muscle fibers in two separate muscles. But all of the fibers that are under the control of a single neuron we call a motor unit. So this is a motor unit over here. So all of these muscles all of these muscle fibers are controlled by this single alpha motor neuron. And then if you look at all of the motor neurons that control a single muscle, we call that a motor neuron pool. So the idea of a motor neuron pool just means that all of these neurons are in the spinal cord, probably all next to each other in the ventral horn, and their axons come out and they all go to the same muscle. And so at any given time, if a muscle is contracting, a subset of the neurons within that motor neuron pool are active. And in fact, one of the ways to change the force that a muscle applies is to increase the number of neurons in its motor neuron pool that are active. So just activating one motor neuron in a motor neuron pool will only produce a small amount of force in that muscle, whereas activating all of the motor neurons in the motor neuron pool will produce the maximum amount of contraction of that muscle. The other thing that affects the muscle force is the firing rate of the motor neurons. So again, motor neurons work the same way other neurons work. So an action potential that starts at the cell body will travel all the way down the axon, and then that releases a neurotransmitter that causes the muscle to contract. We'll talk about how that works later on. But you can measure muscle force pretty easily. So here you've got the muscle attached to a scale or some kind of weight. But again, you can just try to have the muscle or the limb try to lift a weight to measure how much force it's applying. And then they record the electrical activity from the motor neuron that synapses with that fiber. And so down here, they're measuring the action potentials recorded from the neuron. So these are the action potentials. Each of these little spikes is an action potential. and from the motor neuron. So it's coming from this cell up here. And then the muscle contraction is recorded here. So this is the amount of force. And what you can see is that when the action potentials are coming slowly, meaning the time between action potentials is slow. So this is 5 hertz. That means 5 spikes essentially per second from the neuron. The muscle contracts as soon as the action potential gets there, and stays contracted actually for a while, even after the action potential is over, and then really kind of gradually goes back to relaxation. So a contractive pulse like that in the muscle lasts a lot longer than an action potential. Meanwhile, then when the next action potential arrives, the motor neuron or the muscle immediately again contracts. But by that time, the first contraction is over. So if you had a muscle contracting at this rate, about 5 hertz, it would be sort of twitching or vibrating. But if you increase the firing rate of the neuron, so here now the neuron is firing at 10 hertz. So this is 10 hertz over here. It means 10 action potentials per second. Then the muscle contraction waves are happening faster, and here you're seeing that the second wave of contraction starts before the first one has ended. And so what happens is these muscle contraction waves kind of stack on top of each other. So the second one happens before the first one's over, and so it builds on the first one, and the third one happens before the second one's over and kind of builds on that. So the total amount of force you get is greater because the action potentials are closer together. Down here, we've gone from 10 hertz to 20 hertz. So again, we're doubling the firing rate of the neuron each time. And now the muscle contractions are happening so fast that there's just a little tiny dip in between contractions. But so the muscle never really has time to get back to relaxed. However, you're starting to see that there's a maximum force that this muscle can apply. There's only so many fibers that can be activated at once. Once you've activated all those fibers, you're not going to get any more force out of that muscle. And so that's what's happening then when you get to 40 hertz. Now the action potentials are coming way faster than the muscle fiber can respond to. So basically the muscle fiber just maintains a constant level of contraction during that whole time period. And it's also sort of reached pretty much its maximum amount of force that it can apply. So that's another way to control the amount of force in a muscle. Again, either by increasing the number of neurons that are firing at once, or increasing the firing rate of the motor neurons that are synapsed with that muscle. And there are different types of motor units. So remember, the motor unit is the motor neuron plus the fibers that it controls. And they're defined in part by the types of muscle fibers that they innervate. So there are 2 types of muscle fibers. Red muscle fibers are muscle fibers that have a lot of mitochondria. So that means they produce a lot of energy and have a lot of energy kind of stored up. These muscles are slow to contract. That means if you were to record the time it takes for the muscle to contract after it's stimulated, it takes a while to get to its full strength. And they're also slow to fatigue. That means that the amount of time that it takes to return or to run out of energy essentially is relatively slow. So muscles, just like any cell, only has so much energy stored up and can only produce new ATP so fast. So if a muscle uses up that ATP and can't produce more fast enough, then it becomes fatigued and it simply can't contract anymore. Later on, we'll talk about exactly how muscle fibers use energy to produce contraction. And so they're slow to contract, slow to fatigue, and they also have slow motor units. So that means that their neurons fire at a relatively slow rate. White muscle fibers, meanwhile, are called white muscle fibers because they have fewer mitochondria. They actually appear different colors depending on how they're visualized. And they are rapidly fatiguing and rapidly contracting. That means that they contract very quickly, but they also run out of energy very quickly and have to stop. They have faster motor units. Another property is that because they have less energy available, they're capable of what's called anaerobic metabolism. Now, usually that's not because they run out of energy, but because they run out of oxygen. So if a muscle uses oxygen faster than it's coming in, then the cell has to use anaerobic metabolism in order to break down or produce ATP. The different types of muscle fibers are found in different types of muscle, and this is less true in humans. So in humans, most of your muscles are a mixture of red and white fibers, but in animals like birds, for example, the legs and thighs tend to have more red muscle fibers, and the breast muscles tend to have more white muscle fibers. That's why birds like turkey or chicken have what we call dark and white meat. So the red or the dark meat is actually muscle that contains a lot of red muscle fibers. They're dark because all that extra mitochondria contains molecules that sort of give it that appearance, whereas white muscle fibers again lack those molecules. So and the difference also is reflected in how those muscles are used. So in birds, because they use their legs mostly just for perching and standing and occasionally walking, their legs are largely just postural muscles, and so they just sort of maintain contraction over long periods of time. So they need muscles in their legs that are slow to contract, but more importantly slow to fatigue, because they have to maintain contraction for a long time in order to maintain their stance. Whereas the breast muscles, their main job is for flapping. So the breast muscles, when they contract, pull the wings together, pull them downward, and that downward force produces the lift that birds need to fly. Now, of course, in chickens and turkeys, that's not really the case because they don't fly as much. They're bred just to have a lot of breast muscle because we like to eat them, but that's why their muscles are arranged like that. And the same thing is true of human muscles. It's just that, again, our muscles are mixtures of red and white fibers. But again, if you were to look at the fiber content of your arm muscles versus, say, your abdominal muscles, you might find that the arm muscles have more red muscle fibers than white. Also, the ability of white muscle fibers to produce anaerobic metabolism is important for any kind of sustained contraction. The problem with anaerobic metabolism is that it produces a lot of byproducts, like lactic acid, for example, that are not great for muscle tissue. And in fact, the lactic acid produces kind of that burning sensation in the muscles after you've exercised a bunch. So if you've been working out really hard, lactic acid will build up in your muscles, and that produces the pain and soreness you get from large amounts of exertion. Okay, so next time we will talk about muscle excitation and muscle contraction.